It's 15,000 years ago. The sun is dropping, fire is crackling, and someone just handed you a hollowed-out gourd filled with something that smells like rotten fruit and tastes like regret. You take a sip, your face scrunches, your ancestors watching you laugh, and then about 20 minutes later, you feel warm, loose, and suddenly very confident about your ability to hunt a mammoth with a sharp stick. This is the story of how ancient humans got drunk. Not with cocktail, not with craft beer, not with a wine list that requires a translator. We're talking about the very first time a human being intentionally consumed something fermented and discovered that reality could be, let's say, adjusted. And here's the thing that most people don't realize. Getting drunk isn't a late invention. It isn't a byproduct of agriculture or civilization or the invention of the glass. The desire to alter consciousness through fermented beverages might be older than bread, older than pottery, older than almost every other human cultural practice we take for granted today. And the evidence for this is genuinely wild. Let's start with the obvious question. What even is drunkenness from a biological perspective? Alcohol, specifically ethanol, is a small molecule that crosses the blood-brain barrier with almost embarrassing ease. Once it reaches your brain, it interacts with neurotransmitter systems, primarily GABA, the brain's main inhibitory neurotransmitter. It slows down neural firing, reduces anxiety, impairs motor coordination, and lowers social inhibition. That feeling of warmth, that looseness, that sudden urge to tell someone your deepest secret at a party, that's not a cultural learned behavior. That's a biochemical reaction that has been happening inside hominin brain for a very, very long time. But before humans could get drunk, they needed to find alcohol. And alcohol doesn't exist naturally in any meaningful concentration in most environments. It requires fermentation. And fermentation requires sugar, water, yeast, and time. 3 of those 4 things are everywhere. The 4th, time, is the only variable that required deliberate human attention. Because the moment you leave a sugary liquid sitting around in a warm environment, wild yeast from the air will start converting that sugar into ethanol. It's not a secret technology. It's basically just spoilage that happens to feel good. And early humans, like every other animal on Earth, would have encountered this naturally. Here's the genuinely fascinating part. Animals get drunk too. Elephants have been observed consuming fermented fruit and stumbling around. Birds eat fermented berries and crash into windows. Monkeys in the Caribbean have been documented deliberately choosing overripe, alcohol-containing fruits. The drive to consume ethanol isn't uniquely human. It's embedded in a wide range of animal behaviors because ethanol, in small amounts, can be a useful energy source, and in slightly larger amounts, it produces altered states that might have some adaptive value. But humans took this behavior and turned it into a deliberate, intentional, culturally elaborated practice, and the evidence for when that happened is genuinely surprising. The oldest direct evidence of intentional fermentation comes from a site in northern Israel called Raqefet Cave, dating to roughly 13,000 years ago. Archaeologists found stone mortars that contained residues of a fermented mixture of wheat, barley, and possibly other plant materials. This wasn't beer in the modern sense. It was more like a thick porridge-like alcoholic gruel. The people who made it were Natufian, a pre-agricultural hunter-gatherer society that lived in the eastern Mediterranean. They hadn't yet domesticated plants on a large scale, but they were already brewing. This pushes the practice of intentional alcohol production back to before the dawn of agriculture itself. And that matters enormously because it means early humans weren't waiting for civilization to invent drinking. They were drinking before they settled down. They were drinking before they planted the first crops. They were drinking while they were still moving across the landscape, carrying gourds and mortars, and a persistent curiosity about what would happen if they left that fruit juice out for 3 days. Now, let's bring up the truly ancient evidence, because 13,000 years ago is not the limit. In 2004, researchers in China discovered pottery fragments from a site called Jiahu, dating to roughly 9,000 years ago, that contained residues of a fermented beverage made from rice, honey, and fruit. This was a deliberate multi-ingredient recipe, not an accidental fermentation. It required knowledge of how to combine specific ingredients and control the process. The Jiahu brew is one of the oldest confirmed alcoholic beverages on record, and it shows that by 9,000 years ago, people in East Asia had already figured out not just that fermentation works, but how to make it work consistently and in specific ways. This tells us something important about the timeline. The practice of making alcohol is not a single invention that spread from one place. It emerged independently in multiple regions across the world, exactly like fire, exactly like tool use, exactly like language, because once you have sugar, water, and a few days, you have alcohol. And once you have alcohol, you have curiosity about what it does. And once you have that curiosity, you have a tradition that passes down through generations. Let's talk about the archaeological evidence from the Americas, because this is where the timeline gets even more interesting. In the Andean region of South America, researchers have have found evidence of chicha, a fermented corn beverage, dating back at least 5,000 years. But even earlier, there is evidence of fermented beverages made from cactus fruits, from agave, and from various other local plants. The diversity of alcoholic traditions across the pre-Columbian Americas is genuinely staggering. Every major indigenous civilization had its own distinct brewing tradition, its own sacred drinks, its own ritual around consumption. The Aztec had pulque, a fermented agave beverage with deep religious significance. The Incas had chicha, used in ceremonial context. The Maya had balche, a fermented honey and bark drink used in rituals and festivals. And none of these traditions were borrowed from elsewhere. They developed locally, independently, because the human brain, when exposed to fermentation, does the exact same thing everywhere. It tries it, likes it, and then builds a cultural infrastructure around it. Now, let's bring up something genuinely counterintuitive that rarely gets discussed in this context. Not because it made you better at hunting or gathering, but because of its effects on social bonding. Ethanol, in moderate doses, increases social cohesion, reduces suspicion, and promotes trust. A group that shared a fermented beverage together was a group that cooperated more effectively. And in a world where cooperation was literally a matter of life and death, anything that enhanced group cohesion had real selective value. Some anthropologists have even argued that the social benefits of moderate drinking contributed directly to the success of early farming communities. People who drank together stayed together, and people who stayed together survived together. This doesn't mean that ancient humans got drunk every day, or that they were perpetually intoxicated. That's a modern stereotype. What it means is that the practice of intentional intoxication was embedded within social rituals, feasts, ceremonies, and communal gathering. It wasn't an escape from reality. It was a reinforcement of social reality, a way to confirm mutual trust and shared identity. Let's also consider the role of alcohol in religious and spiritual context. Across virtually every ancient culture we have records of, alcohol played a central role in ritual practice. Ancient Egyptians brewed beer that was used as an offering to the gods. The Sumerians had a goddess of brewing, Ninkasi, and their beer was considered a divine gift. The Greeks had Dionysus, the god of wine, whose cult involved ecstatic rituals and altered state. The Vedic texts of ancient India describe a sacred beverage called soma, which was likely a fermented or psychoactive preparation used in priestly ceremony. The pattern is consistent across continents and millennia. Alcohol was not primarily a recreational luxury. It was a tool for connecting with the divine, for marking important social events, and for achieving states of consciousness that were deemed spiritually valuable. This is a fundamentally different relationship with intoxication than the casual, individualistic, often solitary drinking patterns that are common in many modern contexts. Let's bring up something genuinely important regarding the evidence for ancient brewing technology, because it tells us that this wasn't a hobby. This was a serious, organized, technically sophisticated practice. In ancient Mesopotamia, around 4,000 years ago, brewers used a specific vessel called a kulon, or laban, to ferment barley. They had detailed recipes, some of which survive on cuneiform tablets. They understood the importance of cleaning their equipment, controlling temperature, and adding specific herbs or spices to adjust flavor and potency. This wasn't primitive. This was a craft industry, and it operated at scale. Large breweries in ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia produced beer that was distributed as wages to workers. The famous pyramid builders at Giza were paid in beer rations, a fact that has been confirmed through archaeological evidence of workmen's settlement. The idea that ancient workers built colossal monuments with alcoholic beverages as part of their compensation is genuinely striking. It tells you that beer wasn't a luxury. It was a staple. It was nutritious. It was calorie-dense. And it was safe to drink in a way that local water often wasn't. Because the fermentation process kills many harmful pathogens, beer was actually a healthier choice than untreated water in many ancient cities. The irony is genuinely notable. People drank beer not despite its effects, but partly because of its effects, but also because it was safer than the water. And when you think about that, you realize that getting drunk in the ancient world was often a side effect of basic survival. Now, let's talk about the specific methods ancient humans used to drink. This is where the diversity really shines through. Some cultures drank from hollowed-out gourds or animal horn. Others used ceramic vessels, specifically designed for drinking, often with narrow neck that forced you to sip slowly. The ancient Egyptians had a distinct drinking straw, basically a hollow reed, that they used to avoid the thick sediment at the bottom of their unfiltered beer. This is one of the earliest examples of a drinking accessory in human history, and it shows that they cared about the quality of the experience, not just the intoxication itself. In Central Asia, the Scythians, and other nomadic group, used a special type of drinking cup called a right, often shaped like an animal horn, that they would pass around during communal feasts. These rituals were elaborate, with specific protocol for who drank first, how much, and in what order. Drinking was a performance of social social status and collective identity. In the Americas, the use of spondylus shells as drinking vessels by the Maya and other cultures indicates that the act of drinking was tied to prestige and ritual. The vessel itself was often as important as the liquid inside it. This tells us that ancient humans weren't just trying to get drunk. They were engaged in a complex social practice with rules, hierarchies, and aesthetics. Getting drunk was the outcome, but the act of drinking was the real event. And this raises a fascinating question worth sitting with directly. How drunk did they actually get? Was it a mild buzz, or were they genuinely wasted? The honest answer is that it varied enormously depending on context. In everyday contexts, ancient beer was relatively low in alcohol, often around 1 to 3%, comparable to modern non-alcoholic or light beers. It was consumed as a food and hydration source, not as a way to get hammered. The effects were mild and gradual, but in ritual or ceremonial contexts, the alcohol content could be significantly higher. Wine, which appeared later in some regions, had higher alcohol level, up to 10% or more. And there is evidence of distilled spirits in some cultures, particularly in East Asia, where distilled rice, wine, and other spirits date back at least 2,000 years. In these ceremonial settings, the goal was not a gentle buzz. The goal was a profound, altered state, a trance-like condition that facilitated spiritual communication or social transformation. The Dionysian rite in ancient Greece involved wine consumption that was explicitly intended to break down normal social inhibition and allow for ecstatic, sometimes chaotic experiences. Similarly, the pulque rituals of the Aztecs involved consumption that was regulated and meaningful, but could certainly lead to significant intoxication. So the answer to how drunk they got is exactly as drunk as the situation called for. And they were very good at regulating that because they had centuries of experience. This is the real key difference between ancient and modern drinking culture. It was social, it was regulated, and it was embedded in a web of meaning that went far beyond the individual pursuit of intoxication. Let's also bring up something genuinely important about the dark side of ancient drunkenness, because we shouldn't romanticize it. Just like in any era, excessive drinking had real cost. There is evidence from ancient Egyptian and Mesopotamian medical texts that alcohol abuse was recognized as a problem. Physicians prescribed treatments for hangovers, recommended moderation, and noted the negative effects of chronic intoxication on physical and mental health. In ancient Greece, the philosopher Plato famously argued that excessive drinking was a sign of weakness and that young men should avoid it entirely. The Roman historian Tacitus wrote about the Germanic tribes' love of drinking and noted that their feasts often ended in violence. So, ancient humans were not immune to the dangers of alcohol. They recognized the trade-off. The pleasure and social benefit came with risk, and they developed cultural norms to manage those risks. Some cultures had strict rules about who could drink, when, and how much. Others had designated days for heavy drinking, while everyday consumption was restrained. This suggests that ancient people were not out-of-control hedonists. They were pragmatic navigators of a powerful substance that could be both a blessing and a curse. Now, let's bring up one of the most genuinely surprising pieces of evidence in this entire story. The earliest written recipe for beer comes from a Sumerian tablet dating to around 1800 BC. It's a poem, actually, the Hymn to Ninkasi, the goddess of brewing. It describes the entire brewing process in poetic language, from grinding grain to fermenting the mash to straining the liquid. This is not just a recipe. It's a religious text, a cultural artifact, and a tribute to a practice that was already ancient by the time it was written. That's the thing about alcohol in human history. It's not a modern invention. It's not a recent indulgence. It's a practice so old that it was already the subject of sacred poetry when the earliest civilizations were just beginning to write things down. Let's also touch on the role of women in ancient brewing, because this is a genuinely important and often overlooked dimension. In many ancient cultures, brewing was a domestic, predominantly female activity. The beer from Mesopotamia, the chicha of the Andes, the pulque of Mesoamerica, all were traditionally produced by women in the home or in community setting. This meant that women held significant cultural knowledge and social power around alcohol production and distribution. The goddess Ninkasi was female. Her hymn was likely sung by women brewers. In ancient Egypt, women were often the primary brewers and beer sellers. The social dynamics around drinking were, in many ways, shaped by female expertise. This is a nuance that gets lost when we think of ancient drinking as a masculine activity. The reality was more complex and more interesting. So, how did ancient humans get drunk? They left fruit or grain or honey mixed with water in a warm place for a few days. They discovered that the resulting liquid made them feel different. They noticed that it made social gathering more enjoyable, spiritual ritual more intense. They built an entire cultural and technological infrastructure around this discovery. And by the time the first cities rose, the first pyramids pyramids were built and the first poems were written, alcohol was already as old as human society itself. It was not a luxury. It was a basic human technology, a tool for bonding, for ceremony, and for survival. And if you think about it, every time you take a sip of beer or wine or whatever else, you are participating in a tradition that stretches back over 13,000 years to a hunter-gatherer in a cave, wondering what would happen if they left that gruel out just one more day. That's not a bad legacy. That's the story of how humans discovered that sometimes the best things in life are the ones that take a little time, a little patience, and a little yeast.